Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Moose Monroe. The reason I put Moose in there is that when I was growing up in Englewood in the 40s and the 50s, everybody had a nickname. And in 1949, a friend of mine, his name was Donald Akridge, we got our nickname from his brother. My nickname was Moose because I was bigger than most of the kids with a big head and big ears, and I still got a big head and big ears. And my friend was named Crip because he was accident prone. He was broken up so many times. When we was young in Englewood, we had a horse and buggy that ran over his leg and broke his leg. In those days, we had horses and hay rides in Englewood. And I'm here in the public library with my friend Sam Lee, and I'm here going through the yearbooks and doing some of the Black history in Englewood. I've been involved in the Black history in Englewood for maybe 6 or 7 years, starting with Sam Lee. And because African Americans been in Englewood since the 1800s. And I'm here looking through some of the old yearbooks, and we had a lot of great people graduate from Dwight Morrow High School in Englewood and also Englewood High School. The library is right next door to the Renaissance building. The Renaissance building used to be Englewood High School. And in 1931, Dwight Morrow donated the land to build Dwight Morrow High School, and the cornerstone was laid in 31, and the school was completed and opened up in 1934, which is our high school, Dwight Morrow High School. We always had African Americans going to the high school in Englewood. From the 1800s all the way up, there's always were a few. But the elementary schools, sort of like Lincoln School, which is in predominantly African American and Hispanic. Fourth Ward was completely 99% African American students, but the teachers were 99% Caucasian. We had a school by the monument called Liberty School, and that was 90% Caucasian and 10% African American. We had another school called Cleveland, which is Dr. Leroy McLeod on Tenafly Road. It was 100% Caucasian. And our other school we had, elementary school, was Roosevelt, which is over there off Broad Avenue, was 90% Caucasian. Back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s when the blacks migrated to Englewood. The reason the schools were like that is because they were neighborhood schools. And usually neighborhood schools, you get the kids that lived in your neighborhood, which it reminded me of being down south. You went to the school in your neighborhood. That's why it was all segregated. And I'm here looking at some of the yearbooks of some of the great people that came out of Englewood. Dwight Morrow High School was a regional high school then. We had kids coming from Ridgefield, Edgewater, and Oradell because they didn't have a high school. And Dwight Morrow was one of the best high schools in the nation. Some of the famous people, and I'm talking about African Americans, that came out of Englewood High School and Dwight Morrow High School. Starting in Englewood High School in 1920, say 1924, 25, 26, and the 20s, we had a man named Benny Herbert, and he was 6'5", 255 pounds, played all sports, but he also was the director of the Oracle. He also was in the French Club, and he ended up being one of the first dentists in Englewood. We had so many people, and then when Dwight Morrow came, Dwight Morrow, for people that don't know who he was ambassador of Mexico. He was in line to be vice president. He was a friend of Calvin Coolidge, our president, and J.P. Morgan. You know J.P. Morgan from the finances in Wall Street, they all went to Amherst. And he donated the 31 acres of land to build the high school, Dwight Morrow High School. Unfortunately, he died in 1931 before the high school was built. And the first graduating class came out in 1934 from Dwight Morrow High School. And we only had 6 African Americans graduate from Dwight Morrow at that time. And they were all females. Back in those days, just as it is now, the females are the ones who graduate mostly from colleges. African Americans or Caucasians. And the next year, one of the ladies, like my godmother, her name was Thelma Bland, and she was one of the first African Americans to graduate from Dwight Morrow High School. In 1935, it got a little better. We had 16 African Americans graduate from Dwight Morrow High School. And you want to say, why didn't any young men graduate from high school? Well, it seemed like the young men, when they got to junior high school, and as I said, Lincoln School was the primary school that most African Americans went to back in those days. I went to Lincoln School, and Lincoln School was from kindergarten to 9th grade. It was a junior high school and an elementary school. And most of the guys, when they finished 9th grade, they were ready to work or go into the service. So getting back to Dwight Morrow in 1935, one of the greatest men that I know of Englewood, and he passed away about 5 years ago. His name was Witty English. And for those people that know Witty English was a millionaire. He was a real estater. He built over 100 houses in Englewood. And he also was a Tuskegee Airman. And his daughter and son-in-law has his real estate business now. Well, Witty English's father and his 3 sisters and Witty, they and his mother, they came to Englewood from North Carolina in 1929 when they were little kids. And every last one of his siblings graduated from high school, graduated from college. One of his sisters, Josephine English, lived to be over 90 years. She was the first gynecologist in Brooklyn. And they named a theater after her. And her and her sister was in business together. One of his sisters we call Bootsy. She was a real estater also. And the English legacy is in Englewood. You can just go down and see the houses and know people knowing what he did for Englewood, where he used his education to go to college and further things. And that was Witty English. Moving on up to the class of 37 was a friend of mine's uncle. His name was Howard Allen. Howard Allen was one of the great basketball players in the 30s. His brother, Henry Allen, played in the early 30s basketball and baseball at the old Englewood School. But Howard Allen went on to graduate from Dwight Morrow in 1937, made All-State in basketball, and went to college down in Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia. It was called Hampton Institute back then. But then he got drafted into World War II. He went into World War II. And after he came back out of World War II, he went back to Hampton Institute, graduated from Hampton Institute, went on to be a teacher and a coach in a little town called Danville, Virginia. In Danville, Virginia, back in those days, all the schools were segregated. And Danville had a school called Langston High School. and Langston and a place called Lynchburg, Virginia. They were rivals. Lynchburg High School was Dunbar High School. But getting back to Howard Allen, he started the first baseball program that they ever had at that school. He was the basketball coach, the track coach, the football coach. And he had a great career there. And then the state of Virginia found out how good he was doing, and they got him involved in a special program at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia, the all-white university. He was one of the few black professors that came out of there. And he retired and went back to Langston High School, and they named part of the school after Howard Allen, where you see he used his athletic ability to go to college, to get a college degree, and to become a professor. Some people say, well, why didn't he play professional basketball? Well, back in those days, blacks weren't allowed to play, or African Americans weren't allowed to play professional sports. And this is before Jackie Robinson came in 1947. So they had to use their academic skills to get a job and whatnot. Okay, that was in 37. Now we move into the early 40s, and Englewood was known for a place to have great athletes, great scholars, and we have a park called McKay Park. And Sam and I are on a committee called the McKay Park Legacy that Melvin Drayford is the president of, where we try to keep the legacy of the Fourth Ward and McKay Park open, and we had some programs where we inducted certain people into the Englewood Hall of Fame. Now, in the 40s, we had a lot of great individuals. Some of them graduated in the early 40s and went to college, like my old coach, Mr. Eddie Toomer, in 1942. Him, Johnny James, Willie James, and Doc West were three blacks on the track team. And every time they raced the 100-yard dash, they would come in 1, 2, 3. Willie James came in first, Eddie Toomer second, Doc West third. The reason I call him Doc West, George West went on to graduate from Dwight Morrow, went on to college, ended up being one of the first dentists in Englewood. Eddie Toomer went to Springfield College up in Massachusetts, one of the best colleges for physical education. He graduated, came back to Englewood, and became a track coach and a football coach. He was my coach in the late 50s. Willie James became one of the first bus drivers in New Jersey, African-American bus drivers in New Jersey. So all three of them used their athletic skill to go to college and become something. As we move on up to 1945, we had a family on J Street. This is in the 4th Ward. Now, Englewood 4th Ward was predominantly African-American at one time, but before the Dutch came to New Jersey and came to Englewood and built many houses and mansions up on the hill, Englewood Cliffs. And during that time, New Jersey had slaves, and Bergen County had the most slaves in New Jersey. And they were responsible for help building a lot of those mansions. Even up on the hill, you got a big church called a First Presbyterian Church. It was built in 1860, and African Americans helped build that. And they worked for I guess, well, since we up north, we wouldn't call them masters, but they were like they masters, and they slept at the residence that they worked at. In those days, in the late 80s and in the early 90s, African Americans lived in every every ward in Englewood. First ward, which is we would call the wealthy people, where all the mansions. Second ward are wealthy peoples. And the third ward are blue collar, middle class people. And the fourth ward was all the way to lower income. Well, at First Presbyterian Church, the African Americans went to church with their, well, you can say, I wouldn't say masters then, their bosses. And they worshiped with the whites, but they had a bench called the slave bench. And that was the bench that all the blacks sat on to worship the same God that the Caucasians or the whites were worshiping. Then the powers of the be said, let's get them a church. They had a deed to a church down in the lower part of Englewood, down there by the monument, and it was called Dwight Chapel, named after Reverend Dwight. And that became the blacks' church, and then they migrated from there to Calvary Mission, which became Bethany Presbyterian Church, which is on the corner of Palisade Avenue and William Street. That church opened up in the 1880s, and that was one of the first African American churches in Englewood. Englewood is known for their churches, and right now we have at least 10 African American and maybe more African American churches. Bethany Presbyterian 1880, right down the street was First Baptist on William Street, 61 William Street, which opened up in 1891. Then right down the street at 129 William Street, Shiloh, it opened up in 1893. We go by the brook, which was Galilee's Methodist Church, opened up in the 1890s. It burned down in 1958, and now it's over on Genesee Avenue. We also have Ebenezer, which opened up in the 1890s. And most of the black churches were in the black ward. And that's where the African Americans got I would say, congregation, had a place to go and for the kids, and to make sure that the young people and the old people had I guess you would call, a foundation to do many things and live. But Englewood, getting back to the black history of Englewood in the high school, in 1945, we had the Boone family from J Street. David Boone is the youngest. Then we had Jeanette Boone and Nathaniel Boone. All three of these individuals used their athletic ability, went to college. David graduated Nathaniel graduated 1945. And he went to college, graduated from college, was one of the first African Americans to go into the Marines. I don't know if you know that the Army was segregated for many years. And when African Americans been fighting in the wars ever since there were wars. They fought in World War I. They were segregated. They went to France, fought over there, the 369th in New York. A lot of the blacks from Englewood had to fight join the army in New York. And in World War II, they were segregated in World War II, but they fought. I guess you can say you probably only heard of one outstanding African American, and he was a steward on a Navy ship, Dory Miller, and he shot down some of the Japanese planes. But still, they wouldn't let any blacks go into the Marines. But David Boone was one of the first to go in 1945. And he was one of the first African Americans in the United States to take advantage of the GI Bill. He took that bill and went to college, graduated from Harvard, and He's living up in New Hampshire. Him and his wife and his kids graduated from Ivy League schools. His grandkids graduated from Ivy League schools. Then there's Jeanette Boone. She passed away a couple of years ago. She used her education and she ended up working with John Kerry, who was Secretary of State when he was running for president, right from J Street. Then the youngest one, David Boone, ended up graduating from Bates College in Maine. Now, if anybody know about Maine, there's not many African Americans up there, maybe 1%. And him and a guy named John Douglas graduated from Bates College, and David Boone had his own business in New York. And John Douglas became a millionaire with the cable stations in California. And they're still alive, all three of them. Englewood has turned out so many outstanding people. And if you look at some of the buildings in Englewood, Liberty School is named after Russell Major, who was one of the first African Americans on the Board of Education, and he was on the Board of Education for 18 years. That's unheard of. But back then, the mayor used to pick who he wanted to be on the Board of Education. Now you got to vote for it, and you might get 3 years at the most. Okay? Cleveland School is named after Dr. Leroy McLeod, one of the greatest men I know of. Dr. Leroy McLeod came to Englewood in 1942. He was the second black African-American teacher in Englewood and the first African-American principal in Englewood. And the school is named after him. And nobody messed with Leroy McLeod because in those days, we didn't have diapers and child abuse. He had permission to get any kid a spanking. And now you see what happened to Peterson of the Minnesota Vikings for beating this kid with a switch. I know in my days I had to climb the tree and get half a tree to get beat with. But Dr. McLeod became the second teacher. Mr. Norris was the first, but he was killed in World War II. And Leroy McLeod is a legend. We can just go on. Englewood is known for having the first in Bergen County of many things. We had the first African-American police chief, Mr. James Mosley. We had the first African-American fire chief, was J.P. Morgan. We got the first director, a building named after a black man, Raymond Wright. The police station is named after him. Englewood have had a lot of firsts. You hear me talking about a lot of men, but we have had some outstanding African-American women. One woman's name was Shirley Lacey, and she was a councilwoman of the 4th Ward, and she was outstanding. She even led Shirley Chisholm. Those who don't know Shirley Chisholm, and Sam knows Shirley Chisholm. She was a black councilwoman over in New York, and she ended up running for president of the United States, one of the first African-American senators. And Shirley Lacey was in her corner working with her then. We got a middle school named after Janice Dismas, one of the greatest women who died too early. And she was involved in the Board of Education in Englewood. She was a counselor up in Teaneck and did a lot of things in the community. I'm talking about so many individuals, but one of the individuals that the McKay Park legacy we inducted into our Hall of Fame was the great Sherman White. Sherman White graduated from Dwight Morrow in 1947. And he was 6'9". 6'9" is tall right now, but can you imagine in 1947 in high school, Sherman was 6'9", and he had 3 other guys on the team, 6'6". Sherman went to be an All-American and led Englewood for the only undefeated basketball team, 28-0, and they won the state championship. And back then, they used to invite the Jersey teams to play over New York in the Eastern State Championships. And Sherman White and his team won the Eastern State Championship. They beat a team from Virginia. And Sherman White ended up going and starring at LI University in New York. And in his junior year, he was All-American, led the league, led the nation in scoring, 27.7 points and double rebounds, 12.9 rebounds for the year. But then a tragedy came. During that time, they had a lot of the colleges were hooked up with the gamblers, and he got involved in a point shaving game. They would win the games, but they would win it just enough so the bookies can make money. And Sherman White was one of the many that was caught. But he was one of the few that went to jail. Being an African American, all the Caucasian players got off. But they want to set an example with Sherman White. He spent almost a year in the Tombs in New York. And he was barred from the NBA professional. At that time, the Knicks had offered him $4,000 in 1952. I mean, I'll take $4,000 now, but can you imagine what $4,000 was back in 1952? And back then, the teams, the pro teams that were in New York area, they got first choice of the New York college athletes. Sherman ended up being barred. He went on and got a job in Newark, and he changed his life around. He played in a league called the Eastern League, which was a semi-pro league, and I played in that league. And what makes it so significant, in the 50s, if you look at the NBA now, is 75% African Americans. Back then, they would only let 2 African Americans be on a team. It was a quota. And Sherman went on to work in Newark, and he went on to mentor hundreds of young kids and tutored them in their schoolwork and athletic ability. He became an all-star in the Eastern League, and he did that for many years, came to Englewood. And on the holidays in McKay Park, back in the 40s and the 50s, and even the 30s and the 60s, everybody came to Englewood. Some of the greatest players and people came to Englewood to celebrate all our holidays in McKay Park. And McKay Park is a big park. McKay Park was given to the city by Donald McKay. He was the man in Englewood in 1906, 1909. He donated the park. At that time, Teddy Roosevelt, the president, and the Rough Riders, they did army maneuvers out there. But when the migration came in the 20s, where the African Americans came and settled in the 4th Ward, McKay Park became a place for African Americans, and we had picnics and all kind of activities out there on the holidays. The cars were allowed to ride into the park. The churches had all their picnic tables out there, sold food. You even thought it was down south because Mr. Smith used to roast a pig. And some of the top athletes around the East Coast would come to the park to play basketball because Sherman White, the Globetrotters used to come. We had an African American professional baseball team called the Englewood Cubs, and they were one of the top teams in the East Coast. They used to play the Eagles from Newark, and McKay Park was a great place. And we had a place called the Memorial House, which was built in 1916, which was for the community, where they had all kind of activities for everybody, kids, grown-ups. I would say 8 to 80, blind, bow-legged, knock-kneed, and crazy. It was something. We had Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, Brownies, Girl Scouts. We had different clubs. We had cooking that you learn how to cook. They took cooking out of the schools. We went to plays. We went to camp. You had free camps. All this was done in the black community in Englewood. Some of the funny stories are, well, like I told you, my nickname is Moose, and one of my best friends was Crip, and his name was Donald Acreage. And the Acreages, I always said if you had a reunion, you need Madison Square Garden for them to have a reunion. So their father was Doc Acreage, and he was custodian at the old Memorial House. He was our father of the block, and he did a lot of things. I was raised in a foster home. I was born in 1942 in the Harlem Hospital in New York. My grandmother brought me to Englewood when I was 9 months old, put me in a foster home because she worked up on the hill for the rich people. And I didn't have a mother or father, and it was 8 of us raised in the foster home. I was raised in the foster home from 9 months until I was 15. And back then, you know, it was 8 of us, only 2 of us alive now. Back then, we didn't know we didn't have a mother or father because everybody in your community could beat you or feed you. And everybody was like your father and mother. But getting back to Crip Acreage, he was broken up so many times. He would try anything. I remember he was running out in front of the horse and buggy. Mr. McKay would every year give the kids a hayride in this horse and buggy. And the buggy ran right over and broke his leg. One time he was running in the street and a car hit him. And back then, in those days, the cars had those big bumpers on them. They were scared to take him off the bumper, so they drove him to the hospital on the bumper. Then he's going to be out in the park, and I know everybody been in swings before. He used to stand up in the swing and pump. Mr. McLeod said, don't pump up into the swing. Crip pumped up and went over the whole top, broke his leg. Okay? He liked that wine, and back in our days, we had a lot of different wines. We had Gypsy Rose, Boone's Farm, Swiss Up, but the greatest wine we had was Thunderbird. And they would say, Thunderbird, what's the word? Thunderbird, what's the price? 30 twice. Who drink it the most? The colored folks. What's the reason? Apple wine out of season. Hey, we were called colored before we was Negroes and African Americans and black. Yep, that was that Thunderbird. That was Crip's downfall. He was Clark Kent until he drank that Thunderbird. After he drank that Thunderbird one day and got so drunk, he said he's going to jump the big brook, which had a big cement wall. He went and hit the cement and jumped, and he made it, but he hit the other side of the cement so hard that he broke both ankles. They had to take him to the hospital like that. Crip wasn't scared of anything. We used to go to Bear Mountain and a swimming pool place called Anthony Wayne. They had a diving board about, I don't know, 25 feet up in the air. We'll go up there. I went up there. I'm scared. I jumped, come straight down. I look up and hear Crip diving a jackknife off the high diving board. Perfect dive. Wasn't scared of anything. He had a fight with a guy named Edwin Patterson. Edwin Patterson breaks his jaw. He got it wide up. He can't eat. All he can do is drink. And we also had, we learned how to swim. And back in my day, they had polio was out there. And we used to swim in McKay Park Brook. Back then, they still dredging it now to keep it from the flooding, because the Fourth Ward used to flood all the time. We learned how to swim in that brook. The tide used to come over our head. We had all the trees around the park, by McKay Park, and we used to swim butt naked in the brook. And this Hoppy Ellison, the sheriff, he was one of the guys that named me Moose. He gonna dive in the brook, and it was shallow, and he dove, and it was all mud, and he dove straight down, and all you can see is his legs sticking up. We had army camps in Englewood, down in South Englewood. There was a little area down where you have the Crown Plaza Hotel, and you have this big restaurant by Route 4, and all the high rises down there. That was an African-American black neighborhood called the Dump Rats, because it was a dump down there. Anybody lived down there were called the Dump Rats. We also had boxing all our lives. McKay Park, great bombers. We had some great boxers. Gerald Akridge's father, W.T., who fell off a ladder and died when Gerald was young. Lee Davis never lost a fight, but we had a guy named Walls, and the newspaper in New York gave him a nickname. They gave him a nickname called Canvas Walls, because every time he went to fight, he would get knocked out, and he was on the canvas, so they nicknamed him Canvas Walls. Now, also, and I talked to Sam about this because it was a delicate topic, and it still is. Back in the days, we had homosexuals, many of them, and they were part of the community. You know, they wasn't called homosexuals when I was growing up. They wasn't called gays. They were called faggots or homos, but they were a part of the community. And they were some of the talented people I've known. They had one of the two brothers had a wig shop. They made dresses. They could do all kind of things and sing. And then every year they would go to a place called the Rockin' Palace in New York. And it was called the Faggots Ball back then. And they would dress up, and you really couldn't tell at that time if they was a man or a woman, because they looked just like women. I remember, Sam probably remember the old Jukebox Review at the Apollo Theater. They had a show where they had 19 men and one woman, and you had to try to pick out which one was the woman. And they would do the Rockettes dances. They looked like women. And when you went to pick one of those, you picked the wrong one, because the guy that was in charge, the master of ceremony, he was the woman. So, you know, there's so many stories going around, and New York was so close to Englewood, to the black community, 3 miles to the George Washington Bridge, that we went to New York, and New York people came to Englewood. But Mr. McLeod, Dr. McLeod, no one could outrun him, and you better not call him spongy. I wasn't the fastest guy in the world, and I'm standing in McKay Park on the bridge, and I called him spongy, and he was way over on the other side of the park, and he started running. He caught me before I got in the house, beat me all up in the head, and my grandmother said, Mr. McLeod, when you finish, I'm going to beat him. Parents back then did not take sides of the kids. Whatever the grown-ups in the community did, you know, they had permission by the parents to spank you or discipline you. And every parent was your daddy or mom. And that's why the community was so knit and so close. And I remember one time Mr. McLeod, who was at Lincoln School, he was the only black in the junior high school part. We had to wear a tie to school every day. Before all this uniforms and ties that these schools doing now, they were doing that in Englewood Junior High School from the 30s on all the way up. And I started junior high school I started the junior high school in the early 50s. And a guy named Johnny Austin forgot his tie. And we said, man, you better get a tie. You can't go to school because Mr. McLeod will get you. I don't care, man. He went and drew a tie, piece of paper, and drew a tie and stuck it on his shirt. and went in there. Everybody, Mr. McLeod at the door, everybody got their tie on. Soon Johnny came in there, he saw that Mr. McLeod had it and beat him in the back of the head and sent him home, and he had to come back with a tie on. We had so many different things, but you know, we had a lot of good times because the parents and the community looked after each other, and the churches looked after you. It's not like that now. So those are some of the things. I could say some other things, but I don't think this is appropriate time to say them.